Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Today's hearing will examine TSA's relationships with U.S. adversaries and particularly state sponsors of terrorism. Without objection, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Salazar, are permitted to sit with the subcommittee and ask questions of the witnesses. So ordered. Without objection, also, there's a written statement from Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart that he would like submitted for the record. Without objection, that is also ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, our subcommittee is meeting to discuss Transportation Security Administration's international operations and their interactions with adversarial foreign governments, especially the Republic of Cuba, a state sponsor of terrorism. May 20th, 2024 marked the 122nd celebration of Cuban Independence Day, and it's an extremely significant date for Cuban expatriates, such as myself, many of whom fled their home after the communist dictatorship took take over. Each year on May 20th, Cuban Americans remember the sacrifices made to escape communism, celebrate the freedoms we enjoy in the United States, and pray for those who are still subjugated to the rule of the brutal communist dictatorship. However, on May 20th, 2024, TSA and the State Department welcomed the Castro regime agents to the home of the largest population of Cuban Americans in the United States by hosting them for a tour of the Miami International Airport. That's pretty much a slap in the face of the Cuban Americans all across the country, but especially those living in Miami. Serious precautions must be taken while dealing with the communist Cuban regime. Cuba is among the chief counterintelligence and national security threats of the United States. Just 90 miles from the Florida Keys, part of the district that I represent, the regime actively works to deepen ties with our adversaries, such as the Chinese and the Russians, to operate spy bases and conducting joint military exercises with them. Furthermore, our diplomats in Havana have been victims of anomalous health incidents that are potentially the result of a foreign intelligence service using microwave technology to target our foreign service officers, causing brain damage and long-term disabilities. Additionally, Cuba's intelligence services actively recruit spies from the U.S. federal agencies, and some of their agents, such as Victor Manuel Rocha, Kendall Myers, and Ala Belén Montes, have spent decades passing classified information to Cuba. Their information shared to Cuba has caused countless deaths of Cuban citizens attempting to work against the Castro regime and American service members operating around the world. I'm deeply concerned about the somewhat careless nature of this visit. It's evident that TSA and the State Department neglected to take the threat of Cuban officials on American soil seriously, which leads me to believe that they don't think Cuba poses really much of a threat to the United States. TSA and the State Department failed to notify or coordinate this visit with airport authorities, state and local officials, and they did not notify Congress of their intention to host a state sponsor of terrorism on American soil. Furthermore, TSA continued the delegation's visit and allowed the agents access to TSA headquarters after some of my House and Senate colleagues and I sent a letter to the TSA administrator and DHS secretary expressing our outrage. To make matters worse, senior leaders within TSA, including Administrator Pekoski, were unaware of this visit, which further demonstrates TSA's negligence and calls into question TSA's ability to appropriate, interact with adversarial foreign governments such as the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation and the Republic of Cuba. Unfortunately, we have been through this fire drill before with another Department of Homeland Security component. In February of 2023, the United States Coast Guard hosted a Cuban delegation that consisted of the Cuban Border Guard and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Luckily, Congress was notified of this visit ahead of time, and Chairman Green, Chairman McCall, Chairwoman Salazar, and I sent a letter to the Coast Guard leadership and were able to prevent the Castro regime agents from accessing U.S. Coast Guard headquarters and other sensitive U.S. federal government facilities. Immediately following this, Senator Rubio and I wrote common sense legislation that was included in the FY24 NDAA that prevents the United States Coast Guard from working with state sponsors of terrorism on all but the most critical missions such as search and rescue and counter human trafficking. I'm extremely concerned that the Department of Homeland Security lacks the proper policies and procedures across its components to appropriately interact with adversarial nation states, especially state sponsors of terrorism, and learn from past mistakes to take corrective actions in the future. It's obvious that TSA and DHS must improve internal processes, better coordinate international engagements with state and local authorities, and ensure that Congress has the proper visibility into engagements with adversarial nation states. I'm committed to addressing these failures and taking corrective action that DHS has neglected to do on its own. The United States cannot take a back seat and reward the Cuban government with special access in the United States while it carries out major human rights abuses on its own citizens. Thank you to our witnesses, Ms. Harvey and Ms. Fitzmaurice, for appearing before the subcommittee, and I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Jimenez, for calling today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing their expertise on such an important topic. Since the agency's inception, TSA has worked to ensure the security of flights from foreign airports into the United States. Under the Biden administration, TSA continues to carry out a range of activities to secure international aviation, from engagements with the international civil aviation organizations and other diplomatic bodies to managing bilateral relationship with foreign government counterparts to issuing security requirements for air carriers flying into the United States from foreign airports and inspecting them for compliance. To have confidence in the security of all flights entering the United States from abroad, TSA must maintain access to inspect security efforts at foreign airports to ensure they meet U.S. standards. Terrorist threats to U.S. aviation have originated primarily overseas, so ensuring flights inbound to the U.S. are screened to TSA standards is paramount to the agency's security mission. Maintaining access to foreign airports requires diplomacy and reciprocity, including with our nation's adversaries if they have direct flights to the United States. In fact, our adversaries' airports with direct flights to the United States are perhaps the most important locations for TSA to inspect. In the case of recent visit of Cuban government officials to Miami International Airport, I understand TSA has apologized for not notifying local officials in advance of the visit and has pledged to do so for future visits. That said, TSA and the administration have a responsibility under the law to ensure the security of commercial flights from Cuba to the United States, and doing so requires providing some level of reciprocity. For this visit, TSA and the State Department vetted the Cuban officials, escorted them throughout their tour, and did not share any sensitive or classified information. Cuban officials have been regularly visiting U.S. airports for over a decade without incident, under administrations of both parties. Notably, TSA hosted Cuban officials for a visit in 2018 under the Trump administration, and there was no outcry from Republican politicians then. Commercial flights between Cuba and the United States have brought benefits to both countries. During the past year, approximately 2.4 million passengers have traveled between Cuba and the United States, providing opportunity for tourism and family connections, which serve as critical lifelines to many people during Cuba's ongoing economic and humanitarian challenges. Denying Cuban officials The opportunity to visit U.S. airports would put at risk the security of air passengers, ultimately harming the Cuban and American people far more than the Cuban government. International engagement fosters cooperation, even between adversaries, when there is a shared interest in mutually beneficial outcomes. I'm confident TSA will not back down from fulfilling its responsibilities to secure international aviation solely because some of my colleagues are using the agency as a scapegoat to score cheap political points. International air travel is critical to the global economy, and its security must never be compromised. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses about TSA's engagement with Cuba, as well as TSA's work with other countries around the globe. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask for our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Ms. Melanie Harvey serves as the Executive Assistant Administrator for Security Operations for TSA. Ms. Stacy Fitzmaurice serves as the Executive Assistant Administrator for Operations Support for the TSA. I thank both of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Ms. Harvey for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statements.
Thank you. Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. It is my honor to discuss TSA's work to ensure the security of international aviation. Up front, I would like to acknowledge that the TSA could have done a better job coordinating with the Miami airport and local officials for the most recent engagement with the Cuban aviation authorities. While Cuba has visited U.S. airports 6 times since 2011, we did not fully socialize this trip. I'm committed to making sure that does not happen again. TSA is grateful for the authorities and resources provided to us. On behalf of the 57,000 people who serve in TSA's security operations, I thank this subcommittee for your continued support. TSA's mission is to support the freedom of movement for people and commerce. Fundamental to that mission is ensuring flights to and from the United States are secure. Our commitment to secure air travel requires us to engage transportation authorities around the world in areas that sometimes place our employees in harm's way and with countries that may not always share American values. Today, TSA permanently stations 85 personnel to overseas duty locations in 28 countries as attachés, security advisors, trainers, inspectors, and international industry representatives. Over the last 8 months, TSA sent several of these brave men and women into global hotspots, including Ukraine, Haiti, and Israel. Since the 1985 passage of the International Security and Development Cooperation Act, Congress has granted TSA and our predecessor organization the responsibility to assess the effectiveness of security measures maintained at foreign airports that serve as last point of departure to the United States. Congress also granted to the TSA administrator the authority to work with aeronautic authorities of foreign countries that benefit from U.S.-bound flights. As a member nation of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, we also honor the international standard of information sharing regarding security programs, training, and quality control. This past Sunday, TSA screened 3 million people at domestic airports, our busiest day ever. On that day, 471,000 passengers arrived from overseas airports. There are currently 312 last point of departure airports in 115 countries. TSA professionals are engaged daily around the world to ensure the security of those flights. This work makes it possible for TSA to deploy countermeasures, such as federal air marshals who fly on U.S. carriers to and from airports around the world. TSA also deploys experts to assess the security effectiveness of both foreign airports and air carriers directly serving the United States. Our teams have visited Cuban airports 22 times since 2011. During the same period, Cuban officials visited U.S. airports 6 times. Our continued access to these airports and carriers is an international norm reinforced through frequent engagement and reciprocity. As part of that reciprocity, we grant foreign delegations access to our domestic facilities. To ensure the operational security of these visits, we follow strict protocols, which include coordination with DHS, in most cases, local airport authorities, and the Department of State. Cuban delegations receive special handling. The Department of State conducts a review of all visiting Cuban officials prior to issuance of a diplomatic visa. Then DHS Office of the Chief Security Officer individually vets them. Only then is the request approved and scheduled. In closing, TSA's mission is transportation security. In order to protect the United States, we must continue to use all of the authorities granted by Congress and leverage our well-established aviation security partnerships and reputation. Thank you, Chairman Jimenez and Ranking Member Tanadar, for your continued support of TSA, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Harvey. I now recognize Ms. Fitzmaurice for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss TSA's international efforts within Operation Support. Within Operation Support, TSA manages the agency's engagements with and sets the security and regulatory policy requirements for all U.S. aircraft operators at any location, as well as foreign air carriers providing service to the United States from international last points of departure airports. Operation Support works closely with security operations so that our international policy and risk efforts both complement the agency's bilateral government-to-government engagements as well as international compliance activities. These efforts enhance both the security and facilitation of global air travel. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fitzmaurice. Members will be recognized in order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Harvey, state sponsor of terrorism. How many are there on the list, our list of state sponsors of terrorism?
Sir, the Department of State maintains that list, and there are 4 countries on that list:
And who's on that list?
Cuba, North Korea, Syria, and Iran.
And what does that mean, that you're a state sponsor of terrorism?
Sir, I would defer to the State Department for the definition of that.
I would think that if you're listed as a state sponsor of terrorism, it doesn't mean that terrorism happens in your country. It means that you, as the state, actually sponsors the terrorism. I mean, terrorism happened in the United States. I mean, the 9/11 is a great example of that. Everything started in the United States, but we're not a state sponsor of terrorism. It happened in spite of us, and in spite of us, it happened. A state sponsor of terrorism actually sponsors terrorism. Cuba is on that list, is it not?
It is on that list.
Now, when you want this reciprocity, you want to make sure that Americans are, or whoever is traveling to the United States on a plane from, say, Cuba to the United States, it's done in a safe way, correct?
Yes, our job is to ensure the security of those flights.
Do you have any doubt that somebody going from the United States to Cuba, a plane going from the United States to Cuba, is not safe?
I do not have any doubt that...
All right. So all you're doing then is I guess, pleasing the Cuban government that, hey, our planes are safe, so you got to come over and watch and see how we do stuff. Is that pretty much what this reciprocity is all about?
The international standards set by ICAO, that is the definition of reciprocity, that states have the responsibility and are encouraged to visit each other's facilities and understand the security.
They're encouraged. Now, if we denied access to Cuba, their folks, but we had access to theirs to verify that their incoming flights, or at least verify, I mean, really, come on, you're going to verify that they're safe? This is a state sponsor of terrorism, for God's sakes. They can show you whatever they want, their procedures and all that, and they might not follow them at all because they are a state sponsor of terrorism. So if you deny them access to us, but we have access to them, Then who's would if we said, okay, we will still continue to fly to Cuba, all right, unless you don't want us to anymore, wouldn't it be up to Cuba to decide that they don't want those flights anymore?
I have no doubt that if we restricted access for Cuban delegations to visit our airports, particularly those last point of departure airports to their airports, that they could deny us access.
They could.
Yep.
Not that they would, but they could.
I think that would be a likely result.
I think, I disagree with you, because that's a lifeline to the Cuban regime. They need those flights. They want those flights. It supplies them with much-needed revenue, cash, and it kind of keeps them afloat. So I disagree with you. Seeing that I'm Cuban, I kind of know what I'm talking about. The vetting process that you all talk about. How do you vet somebody who is an agent of a state sponsor of terrorism?
Sir, the process is that the officials from any country who's traveling here submits their passport and information to TSA. TSA provides that information to both the Department of State for processing of a visa, as well as DHS Chief Security Officer to do the background checks.
And who provides the information? Where do you get the information from?
We receive the passport information from the foreign
From the state
delegations.
sponsor of terrorism?
We receive it from the foreign delegations.
From the state sponsor of terrorism. So you vet a state, you vet an agent from a state sponsor of terrorism from the state sponsor of terrorism. That's how you vet people?
We use the passport information submitted by the foreign government to do vetting, no matter what country they are from.
And you think that's adequate? So we have other folks. So if we now had direct flights to Iran, we would allow the Iranian government, who we know sponsors terrorism with Hezbollah and Hamas, et cetera, we would allow their folks to come into our facilities to view our procedures, our equipment into sensitive areas so that we can have reciprocity. I think that's insane, to be honest with you, especially if they're on our list of state sponsors of terrorism. So I guess we're going to have to write another law. I'm going to be looking for Senator Rubio to join me in that one, and then we'll see what happens with this. And I understand the reciprocity thing, but I'll bet you a lot. I'll bet you on my salary, actually, that the Cuban government will not stop flights to Cuba, all right? If we say, no, you can't visit our facilities. And if we allow state sponsors of terrorism to send their agents into our airports to look at our facilities, I just don't think that's right. So my time is up, and I recognize the ranking member from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Now, since 2011, I believe there were 6 Cuban visits to our airports, while TSA visited Cuba 22 times. So we got 22 times we got access to Cuban facilities, Cuban airports. Now, how has this interaction helped the people of the United States in terms of security? How does that has helped maintaining a secure environment for the people of the United States?
Sir, thank you for that question. First of all, I would note that 2 million people fly back and forth to Cuba in a year, and the security of those flights that is guaranteed by these assessments and inspections is TSA's paramount concern. In a GAO study, they found that our engagements, through their own analysis of our data, they found that these engagements and assessments tend to improve the vulnerability scores of the countries that we work with. In the case of Cuba, we have seen that they have deployed more technology, more advanced technology, specifically explosive trace detection technology in all of their airports, which they did not have a few years ago. We also, I can't share a lot of information in this setting, but I can share that in our most recent assessment of the Cuban last point of departure airports, that there were no findings. They are fully compliant.
Now, under the Trump administration, were there any Cuban visits to the United States under the Trump administration?
So the last visit by a Cuban delegation to United States airports was in 2018.
Which is happened under the Trump administration. Now, what did the Cuban delegation see during the 2018 visit, and how did it compare to the visit this year?
The visit in 2018, the delegation had a tour of the checkpoint at TSA airport, right across the river. They saw the canine operations at the checkpoint. They also went next door to the TSA in a security integration facility, our lab of sorts, where we test out new equipment and approve it before it's deployed to the field. They then went to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where they visited the Federal Air Marshal Training Center and saw how we train federal air marshals. They also received a briefing on how we do covert testing, and they capped off their visit at Philadelphia Airport, where they saw a demonstration of how we do covert testing, checkpoint operations, as well as the cargo operation.
So was that the extent of access, was that any different now compared to when the Cubans visited under Trump administration?
These visits are a norm. As you've noted, we've had 6 visits from the Cuban delegation since 2011, and this visit, there was nothing out of the norm. It was a routine visit where they wanted to visit Miami because that is the major last point of departure for them.
All right, so they basically saw the same thing, what they saw under the Trump administration. Now, in 2018, did you hear of any Republican politicians complaining about the access or the visit by Cuban authorities to the United States?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay. Now, if TSA were to stop hosting Cuban delegations, do you believe, like, we got more access to Cuba 22 times compared to the 6 visits that they made to us. But if we stop this unilaterally, we stop them from coming to the United States, do you believe that we will get access to the Cuban airports and their security? And ultimately, if neither side wants to give this access, what does that do to the security of American citizens?
Thank you for that question. Access is an international norm among countries. I think if we, the Cuban delegation, representatives of their aviation authority, they want to see how we operate flights to their country, just like we want to see how they secure the 6 last point of departure airports. I believe if we cut off access for visits to United States airports, that they could do the same. And that would have the result of eventually likely cessation of service between the 2 countries.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Harvey, Cuba has been designated as a state sponsor of terror. Are you aware of that, right?
I am aware of that.
Okay, so let me just, for the record, out of respect for the ranking member, here to my left, there's a great difference between the United States of America visiting Cuba 22 times versus them visiting us 6. In 100% of those visits, we're not a designated state sponsor of terror, and they are. I mean, this is the key factor here. You know, the notification of Congress of such a thing is what the founders would expect as a constitutionalist. Is what I would look for. The executive branch has broad authorities to interact with nation states across the world. Some of these interactions are secretive and take place overseas. Some are secretive and take place in the sovereign soil of our nation. But when you have an executive branch initiate an interaction where security procedures and policies of our ports are exchanged with a nation state, a foreign nation state that has been determined as a designated state sponsor of terror. And it's incumbent upon the executive branch to advise Congress of such a thing. And historically, this has always been the case. I was one of the lead voices for the impeachment of Alejandro Mayorkas. And this is reflective of the kind of disregard for executive branch responsibility that drove me and many of my colleagues to look very hard at the service of Secretary Mayorkas and ultimately conclude that because he would not, one, stop his actions that were injurious to the United States of America and correct course, and number two, resign, then we had to seek impeachment, which we did through this committee. 15-hour markup. It was quite grueling, and we passed it through the House. So let me just ask you, who authorized this, Ms. Harvey? Who authorized this visit? Who made the decision, don't notify Congress?
Sir, there was no decision to not notify Congress, and I apologize that we did not properly coordinate this visit. We have not notified Congress in the past. This was a...
You have notified. Well, maybe not you, but TSA has notified Congress in the past. That's been historically the precedent that was set. It's very much different for Congress to not be notified of such a visit. Somebody, it's always one guy, somebody has to make that decision. Like, don't notify Congress of this interaction. And I suspect it was Alejandro Mayorkas. He's in charge, is he not? I believe he's still, contrary to my wishes, I'd have him out. But I believe he's still the Secretary of Homeland Security. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so who ultimately made the decision to bring state sponsors of terror into our nation to review and tour the security apparatus of our airports? The guy running the Department of Homeland Security, who allegedly has invested his life into the security of our homeland, one would hope. Did he make that decision?
Sir, he did not make the decision to invite the Cuban delegation to visit United States airports. This visit was a routine visit. We've hosted these delegations before.
It's a routine visit?
They have visited 6 times
Well,
since...
please shed light on that for America. Do we have North Korea over here?
We do not.
Well, wouldn't that be routine?
No, there are no last point
How
of
is Cuba
departure.
different?
There's no last point of departure airports from North Korea or any of the other state sponsors of terrorism. That's what makes Cuba unique.
Agreed, which is why it's uniquely incumbent upon the executive to notify Congress of such a visit. Because we don't have these visits from North Korea and Iran. We expect notification of such things. And I would say that the founders would have anticipated that the legislative branch would have been notified of such things from our executive branch. My time is exhausted, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this important hearing today. My district is home to many Cuban Americans, some of whom have personal stories about fleeing this communist dictatorship and the dangers of this ongoing regime. Given Cuba's proximity to the U.S., the ongoing political environment and hostility, Cuba's alliance with many of our foreign adversaries, any engagement by our government with Cuban officials is of key concern to state and local elected officials and to Congress. And as we have been discussing here today, the Department of State identifies state sponsors of terrorism as countries that have, quote, repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism. End quote. Now, as you have discussed here today, Ms. Harvey, there are currently 4 countries listed as state sponsors of terrorism: Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. Has TSA ever conducted inspections of airports in Iran, North Korea, or Syria?
Not to my knowledge.
And has TSA, to your knowledge, hosted personnel from Iran, North Korea, or Syria at any of our U.S. airports?
No, ma'am.
Does TSA, to your knowledge, have any contact at all with official government leaders from Iran, North Korea, or Syria?
No.
So it is only in the case of Cuba that we have had this sort of interaction or visit to our airport facilities. Is that right?
That is correct.
And if I understand your testimony correctly, it's not just that they have visited. While those officials were here, they were provided a tour and an overview of our checkpoints, our K-9 program, screening equipment, air marshal training, covert testing, and checkpoint operations. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And could you please share with us about any future engagements that are planned with officials from the Republic of Cuba that you're aware of?
We are not aware of any trips by the Cuban delegation to travel here to the United States airports. We do plan to send our inspectors to visit their airports and assess the carriers that have last point of departure service to the United States later this year.
And given Cuba's status as a state sponsor of terror, does it not concern you that we have actually shared with representatives of the Cuban government information about some of the most critical safeguards in place that secure our airport and air travel for Americans?
Ma'am, in the visit earlier this summer in May, they did not receive access. We did not provide them any written sensitive material. We call it sensitive security information, nor did they see SSI while they were here.
And so do you believe, you mentioned earlier, and I'd like to hear more about going forward efforts to make sure that if there are individuals from any country identified as a state sponsor of terror, but in particular Cuba, that you all intend to make effort to ensure we're notified as Congress or state or local leaders. Could you share with us a little bit more about that?
Yes, ma'am. We have put, following this event where we did not properly coordinate with Miami Airport, who's been an extraordinary partner with us, we put an administrative directive in place that requires formal notification to the U.S. airport authorities well in advance of a planned trip to ensure cooperation, coordination, and agreement that the visit will be beneficial.
And do you have any awareness of a new report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies that reveals that Cuba is building a new spy base near the city of Santiago de Cuba?
I'm not aware of that.
And then in November 2022, the FCC had a similar finding that Cuba was cooperating with China on furthering surveillance operations.
I'm not aware of that.
Do you have any concern that we should be revisiting any security agreements that are presently in place with the Republic of Cuba?
So TSA has a really narrow focus, and our job really is to ensure that the airports with last point of departure service, with direct service to the United States are secure, and that the 2 million passengers that fly back and forth every year, most of them Americans, are safe on those flights.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady from Florida yields. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, is recognized for 5 minutes for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to everyone on the panel for being here today. Ms. Harvey, do you understand the concern from this committee about the visit? Do you understand why there would be concern?
I do understand the concern.
You know, it's hard for some of us to watch. I've actually questioned Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, who the chairman was asking, did he authorize this visit from the Cubans to come in and be able to witness and take a look at our security systems within our airport if he's playing for the other side. And that's not something that's easy for me to even ask. But when you look at what's going on at our southern border, when you look at the increase in individuals on the terror watch list from the last administration to this administration, I believe the numbers were 14 individuals encountered on the terrorist watch list under the last administration to well over 350 now When you look at how many the increase in how many Americans are dying from fentanyl, how many individuals from MS-13 and other gangs have been allowed to come into this country, and now on a daily basis, you can almost read a story about how one of them has raped and killed one of our American daughters. It's hard to even imagine sometimes why these things are being allowed to happen. And now we come into this hearing and we're talking about why Cubans, who are known state sponsors of terrorism, who are known communists, who sell intelligence to the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians, why are they being allowed to come into our airports and survey and look at some of our sensitive technologies? Do you understand why that might be concerning to this Congress?
I do understand.
Do you understand why there's a concern that we weren't notified?
Sir, I do understand why there's a concern, but I will note that that's not been a norm. We host foreign delegations frequently, and we have not notified Congress in the past of those.
Right, but are most of them state sponsors of terrorism?
Just Cuba.
Okay, so there you go. So when you say you don't understand, and then you talk about how many other host nations and countries we allow to come in here and look at our security apparatus, yet they're not state sponsors of terrorism, that should be your answer right there. There shouldn't be any question about why the concern. That's it. That's it. Were these communists who came from Cuba, and they are communists, is that correct, Ms. Harvey?
I don't know the affiliation of the people who came, sir.
Oh, really? You don't know?
I don't.
Really? You think that the communists in Cuba would allow people in their delegation to come over here and not be communists? You think that's how communism works, Ms. Harvey? I'm asking you a question, ma'am.
I understand.
Okay. All right. Were these Cubans that were allowed to come and tour our airports and look at our security apparatus, our systems, were they prevented from seeing anything? And if so, what?
Sure, there's a lot of things that they didn't see. We did not provide them any sensitive security information. They don't have information on the detection standards of our technology. We did not provide them the details of our standard operating procedures that are SSI. We gave them information that's generally available to the public or that a passenger could see after they are screened and transit into the secure area.
Yeah. Were they allowed, when you say that they only saw things that a typical passenger would see, Ms. Lee was saying that they got to look at our K-9 program. Is that correct?
They observed K-9 operations at the passenger screening checkpoint, yes.
Yeah. Is that something that typical American passengers leaving the country get to see?
Sure, if the K-9s are operating at that time.
Okay, so they didn't get to go back behind closed doors, look at the kennels, anything like that?
No, sir.
Okay. Is there anything else that they weren't allowed to see, ma'am?
I'm sure there is a lot that they were not allowed to see. We didn't take them on a tour of our secure flight facility or talk about, the back end for how we vet things. They really received they were at Miami Airport for a few hours in May.
Let me ask you this one last thing, because my time is running out. Given the concern that this committee has just wanting to protect American citizens, will you commit to doing everything in your ability to make sure that Congress is aware the next time a visit is scheduled?
Sir, I will take that back to my leadership for consideration, yes.
Thank you, Ms. Harvey. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. If members are going to have additional questions, then we're still going to recognize Mr. Lalota for his first question, but if members have additional questions, we're going to accommodate that. I'm going to recognize the ranking member for an additional question at this time.
So this visit that happened in May, is that a routine visit?
Yes, it was we considered a routine visit.
Was it any different from the visit that happened in 2018 under the Trump administration?
I think they saw the tour was much more extensive in 2018 when they visited. They did visit the Federal Air Marshal Training Center in 2018. They saw cargo operations and they received a briefing on how we do covert testing as well.
So under the Trump administration, the Cubans got more access and more information than what was provided under the Biden administration in the most recent visit. Is that right?
Sir, they had a much fuller itinerary, yes.
So and was Cuba a state-sponsored terrorist back then in 2018 when they visited under Trump administration?
They were not a state sponsor of terrorism until 2021.
Okay. So now, so the hope here looks like is that we stop them from coming to us, but we will still have access to Cuba, and this will not impact the security of American passengers. Do you buy that?
I think we need access and we need exchanges of information. I do understand the concern about state sponsors of terrorism. The one thing I think people can agree on is if Americans get on a flight here or anywhere in the world headed for the United States, that they expect that that flight is safe and secure.
All right. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ms. Harvey, is Cuba known to the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism?
Yes, sir, they are on the list.
And when did the United States designate Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism?
Several times throughout history, most recently.
Most recently, Ms. Harvey, when was the last time the United States designated Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism?
January 12th, 2021.
Thank you. And Ms. Harvey, you work for an agency within the Department of Homeland Security?
I do.
And Ms. Harvey, what is the mission of the United States Department of Homeland Security?
If TSA's mission is freedom of movement.
Nope. The question was, what is the mission of the Department of Homeland Security?
To keep Americans safe in the homeland.
Specifically, with honor and integrity, we will safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values is the mission for the department for which you work. Ms. Harvey, you work for the Transportation Security Administration?
Yes, sir.
And that's an agency within DHS?
Yes.
And at TSA, you have a responsibility to protect our nation's transportation systems,
Yes, sir.
including our airports?
Yes, sir.
And approximately, what is the TSA's annual budget?
I think it is about $11 billion.
And approximately, how many people does the TSA employ?
62,000.
So, Ms. Harvey, keeping in mind the mission of the department for which you work, and again, I'll remind you, since you didn't know it, safeguarding the American people, our homeland, and our values, was it a good idea to invite agents, officials from a state sponsor of terrorism to tour the Miami International Airport?
Sir, we took precautions to ensure we didn't share any sensitive information. These visits are reciprocal visits. They have access to see airports and operations.
Can I take that as a yes, Ms. Harvey? That it was a good idea?
Yes.
Was it also a good idea not to inform top officials, including members of Congress, with respect to inviting agents from a state sponsor of terrorism?
Sir, I've apologized that we did not fully coordinate this visit.
Appreciate that. The concern this committee is expressing, and I recognize the ranking member's rebuttal to it, is not taken in a vacuum. It's in a more global approach on this administration, the Biden's administration's approach to some bad guys around the world. Now, we've seen what has happened with Iran, we've seen what's happened with China, with Russia, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now we're seeing Cuba, a weak response to this government's interaction with bad folks from around the world. That's the frame in which, and that's the lens from which we're looking at this. And specifically, you've mentioned reciprocity, that essentially, and if I'm wrong, please do correct me, ma'am, that TSA, in your words, is inviting Cuban officials here because it thinks we're getting something in return. Is that generally what you're saying?
We need access to their airports in order to ensure the security of the flights.
Thank you. The issue, and the greater issue that this committee has, this Homeland Security Committee has, this administration canceled something called Remain in Mexico, a policy in which migrants who were trying to come into the country had to wait in Mexico before they were paroled in, an effective policy that this administration canceled and got nothing in return. So I'm going to ask you this. The criticism is on you right now for allowing these officials from a state sponsor of terrorism within our own borders to view our airports. And I'm a New Yorker, and 9/11 killed too many Americans. And it happened because folks penetrated our aviation system. That is why the Homeland Security Department was formed. That's why you have a mission. That's why we have a TSA. So what did you get in return for allowing these officials to come into our country to view our spaces that make us vulnerable. What did you get in return?
We have full access. While they spend a few hours at our airports, we spend days at their airports assessing everything from the fence line in, and also access to their security procedures to ensure they are compliant with standards and recommended practices.
Would you agree, and if a classified setting is required, to explain more in depth what that exchange of information entails? This committee is very interested to know that we are getting the better end of the deal. That when this administration does deals with Iran, Russia, the Taliban, Mexico, that we get the better end of the deal. Would you commit to revisiting us and tell us exactly what it is that you got in exchange for allowing agents from a communist country, from a state sponsor of terrorism on American soil?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to brief you on that.
I yield, Chairman. Yes, sir.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think obviously this is an important discussion, which I certainly appreciate, and I think obviously we can all have different perspectives on our relationship and the U.S.-Cuba really delicate relationship that exists here and globally. Just to be clear, I think most folks believe that the Cuban government represses its people, there's human rights abuses, there's a 62-year policy of isolation and embargo that has failed its people, and certainly there are enormous political and human rights concerns that I think we all share regardless of our political perspectives. I also think there is some difference into how we may view that relationship between members of Congress and certainly the way I view the relationship moving forward. I also think it's important that we're careful about making allegations that routine TSA inspections, of which there has been prior agreements between governments, is somehow undermining our national security. I think that is a very serious accusation to make, and it's one that needs to be handled, I think, very carefully. U.S. security is enhanced by the work the TSA does with all of our partners, and I just want to thank you for that work. Now, Ms. Fitzmaurice, am I correct that inspections of TSA screening operations have occurred 6 times since 2011 under both Democratic and Republican administrations?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And am I also correct that the last inspection prior to the one that we're discussing today was in August 2018?
Yes, that's correct.
And in August 2018, that was under President Trump. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. I also know that in return for letting Cuban inspectors check our U.S. airports, we're able to have U.S. inspectors go to Cuban airports. In fact, U.S. safety and security has benefited with far more U.S. inspections over the years, and that's of benefit to us in the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Ms. Fitzmaurice, while there have been 6 Cuban inspections since 2011, how many U.S. inspections of Cuban airports have there been in that same time?
22.
So there's been 6 inspections that they have done. We have done 22. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So these agreements are common with countries where we have direct flights, and certainly not particular to Cuba alone. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So these relationships and these inspections to other countries are happening to many other countries, not just Cuba, to reinforce that point. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So Ms. Fitzmaurice, of U.S. airports with flights to Cuba, which U.S. airport has both the most flights and the most passengers?
It's Miami.
Thank you. And I think that is obviously one of the reasons why we're having this discussion today, but I want to make that point that it is the most traveled as it relates to flights and direct flights. Americans are going to Cuba. Let's be very, very clear about that. Now, the Cuban inspectors who visited Miami were vetted by both the State Department and Department of Homeland Security. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The tour was only about 2 to 3 hours, and the inspectors were escorted the entire time. Is that correct?
Yes, they were escorted, excuse me.
And is it true that there was no sensitive security information that was revealed during that tour?
That is correct.
Thank you. That's good. That's good to hear. Is there any reason at all to believe that this visit, quote, allowed potential vulnerabilities to be exposed, quote, or is putting Americans at risk?
No.
Thank you. I'm glad. I want to clear that up as well. And in fact, much of the tour is also available to folks that are going in and out of the airport. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So if we decide to start blocking Cuban inspectors from coming here, wouldn't Cuba then just block U.S. inspectors from visiting Cuba?
That is certainly a concern.
And I think that is really the real crux of the issue here. I trust our Homeland Security personnel, our State Department personnel, the TSA, and I want to ensure that they have access to these Cuban airports and certainly these facilities where we have countless Americans going to every single day throughout the year. Americans are going to Cuba. We know this to be true. Now, 1.1 million travelers fly between the U.S. and Cuba last year on American, JetBlue, United, Southwest, and Delta flights. People-to-people exchanges are positives. Families oftentimes need to be reunited, and I think this is a good and healthy thing. And for those that don't know and who want to cut off travel from the U.S. to Cuba, attacking routine TSA inspections is maybe a convenient way to achieve those goals, but it's certainly not productive in our long-term effort to ensure that Cuba becomes a strong democracy. And so thank you both for your testimony, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I recognize myself for a couple of additional questions. Just for the record, for those across the country, and maybe in the back row that haven't heard, in 2018, under the Trump administration, when you had a somewhat similar visit, Cuba was not a designated state sponsor of terror. Just putting that out there. Some of you might want to consider. Quite a difference. Now, Cuba is a designated state sponsor of terror. If this is a designation that has any significance or meaning to us, then we should be protective of the security apparatus of our ports, our airports, in this case, to protect American travelers. If it doesn't have any significance, then why have the designation? If you're not going to protect the security apparatus of our airports from careful review by state sponsors of terror, then why have a designation of state sponsor of terror? Maybe we're making too much of this. Maybe it's not a big deal to this administration. It's certainly something that America should consider. So let me ask, during this extended tour of our TSA facilities in the Miami airport, were there any precautions taken for these communists that came through our airport security checkpoints? Like, did we take their phone or anything like that, Ms. Harvey?
Sir, we vet them before they come. They're escorted the full time. They're screened before they have access to our facilities, and we did not share sensitive information.
Did we take their phones?
To my knowledge, we did not take their phones.
Okay. So when myself and my colleagues, when we enter a secured area, a SCIF, or when we go into a confidential briefing in the auditorium, a large briefing for members of Congress, we have to leave our phone outside, right? I recently went to the D.C. jail to pray with inmates there. To enter that facility, I had to leave my phone. So it's not, don't look at me like I'm crazy. We have state representatives selected by the communist state of Cuba to come into the United States and tour the secured areas of our airports, and they're carrying their phones with them. They're selling everything they've got to their colleagues, their comrades in China or Russia. So we think it's cool for them to have their phones. American citizens, American congressmen are not allowed to have our phones in secure briefing areas. With this administration going to wave communists into our major airports to tour the security areas of our airports, and they can keep their phones, you know. This is why, ultimately, the founders gave us a solution called elections. Does the gentleman from California have any further questions? We had a second round of questioning, good sir. If not, I believe we're prepared to close. I thank the witnesses for their testimony, and we do respectfully appreciate you being here. There were some difficult questions you fielded today, and it was certain tone you had to tolerate. So we respectfully thank you for your patience. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask that the witnesses respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7 Delta, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days for you to receive those questions in writing. Without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.